Let me start by saying hello. Even on January 13th, we can still say Happy New Year to people. I'm really glad that we are back here, and we are starting the year with a great cast today. So we're going to have Alex Teytelboym from the University of Oxford, who's going to be presenting an adaptive targeted field experiment, job search assistance for refugees in Jordan. I've only touched upon a small part of Alex Teytelboym's interest in research regarding refugee resettlement, but his work is amazing, and he might be one of the first entrepreneurs that we have as a researcher presenting here. He's a co-founder of Refugees AI, an organization developing new technology for refugee resettlement. So there are many topics on which he could talk, but we decided that today he would tell us about this job search assistance for refugees in Jordan. I remind you the rules of the game. He's going to talk for 45 minutes after I shut up, which is going to be soon. But I want to let everybody know that you can use the Q&A section to make questions, and you would have the advantage of having Maximilian Kasy, Alex's co-author, handling part of these questions. Whenever there is a difficult question, he would pass it to Alex. And we would have 15 minutes at the end for general discussion. I also want to welcome our set of panelists that agreed to be here with us. They can participate as in a regular seminar, unmute, and ask questions directly to Alex in any moment. Okay, so this is your time, Alex. Thanks a lot for accepting to be the first speaker of the year, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesus, and Simona, thank you so much for the invitation. Really excited about this paper with my wonderful co-author, Max Kasy, and also with Stefano, Caria, who's now at Warwick, Simon Quinn, who's also at Oxford, Soha Shami, who did a lot of the ground work, and she's now with the Danish Refugee Council, and Grant Gordon, who led the team from the International Rescue Committee, who funded a lot of this. So this is a slightly unusual project for me because, as Jesus said, I've been working on refugee resettlement and mainly working on theory issues and applying theory in practice, and this is a much more empirical issue. But I'm very glad to have Max here because he can answer all the difficult questions, hopefully, on my behalf in the meantime. So I have a lot of slides, in part because there's so much going on, and I think once we get to the discussion, I can always flick to the relevant slide. So please don't worry, I will go reasonably quickly to try and cover the stuff. But there's more stuff here that I could probably do in 45 minutes. But it's hopefully still going to be useful to have some of the bits here. So what's our big story here? So this paper sort of has two parts. One part of it is sort of methodological, and the other part of it is really specifically about labor outcomes of refugees. And you can pick which part you find more interesting. I guess as this is a seminar on migration, a lot of you will be interested in our empirical results, but I really want to stress that I think the methodology we're using here is quite exciting and hopefully can be used for other issues, with refugees or migrants and so on. So what we want to suggest is a new algorithm for doing field experiments, and it's going to balance these two objectives, and I will explain why it will balance them. One is precise treatment effect estimation, which you're all very familiar with if you've done randomized control trials, and the other one is welfare maximization, which you're all very familiar with if you're an economist, because this is kind of what we do, at least when we do economic theory. And in part, this is, we think this is important. This second part in particular is very important because RCTs are getting a bit of flack at the moment, because often RCTs are done in settings where the populations are very, very vulnerable, and refugees are obviously a great example of this. And RCTs are going into all sorts of places which are, very important, including COVID, of course. Some authors, including Angus Deaton, have suggested that perhaps we are not using RCTs in the best possible way. So Angus Deaton has a lot of problems with RCTs, so we're not going to be able to solve all of them, but we will be able to tackle some of the issues. In particular, he does point out that complete disregard for the welfare of study participants is a big downside of RCTs. So what's going to be good about our algorithm? It's going to have two features. One is that it's going to be adaptive, and that means that what it will do is treatments are going to be assigned over time, and what we will do is we'll use the information, the outcomes of the earlier cohorts to optimize the assignment of treatments for the later cohorts. And that's the bit that is going to allow us to improve welfare of the study participants, because we'll be learning something from the early assignments, and so people later on will be able to benefit. And it'll also be targeted. This might be more familiar because it is simply saying that different treatments might work well for different groups, and especially in this adaptive setting, this is going to be quite nice. Now, to be a bit more precise, what we're going to do is we're going to combine two very classic treatment assignment protocols. One of them is called Thompson sampling, and I'll tell you about what that is. And the other one I'm sure you're familiar with. This is just uniform random sampling when you assign each treatment with an equal probability. This is what we do in a randomized control trial usually. So let me quickly, I mean, this is not really, don't really need to tell you about refugees in an economics of migration seminar, but, very quickly, there are, more refugees than in any time since the Second World War. As you know, most of them live in developing countries, and our context is, of course, Jordan, which is a developing country. And what we're interested in is trying to figure out what's preventing refugees from working. There are, of course, many things that are preventing refugees from working, but Jordan is a comparatively mild environment, as I will point out, for Syrian refugees, compared to some other contexts in which refugees are completely shut out of the labor market. So in particular, what we know, and from other labor market contexts is, and this kind of maps somewhat to the refugee context as well, is that, refugees have at least three of the following problems. So one of them is liquidity constraints. So a lot of them have, lost things in the process of forced migration. So they find it difficult to afford, looking for work and finding the best employment. They don't have a lot of information about the new labor market because it's a new labor market. And of course, a lot of them have experienced very traumatic things. And so there might be these psychological barriers. So what we'll do is we'll try and use interventions that try to ameliorate these things. So one of them is to give them cash transfers to relax liquidity constraints. The other one is to provide information about how to go about doing interviews and filing applications in this new job market, and then also provide behavioral support of the kind of a calendar for job applications in order to control, to address these self-control problems and motivation. So this will all happen in Jordan, as the title suggests, and we'll have a sample that will include both Syrians and vulnerable Jordanians. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's done in the partnership with the International Rescue Committee, wonderful organization that works all over the world. So what do we find? This is, I guess, to the economics of migration crowd that is mostly interested in the results. Well, the interventions that we try are actually interventions that have been shown to work in other contexts, not with refugees, but with other vulnerable populations. But actually what we find is that the impacts on formal employment, and we can maybe discuss this, I don't know if I'll have time to go into the detail of exactly how we measure employment, but after 6 weeks, we had very small impact and on employment. There seemed to be larger impact going slightly further out after 2 and 4 months. And in particular, the thing that seems to work well is the cash grant. And Max can maybe mention some of the interviews that he did with the refugees. And it becomes a bit clearer why it might have worked quite well, I think, in these interviews too. So these are not long time frames. These are still short time frames, but it seems like on the shortest time frame, which is actually the one that we used for the adaptive targeted design, there were very small impacts on employment. So it seems, I don't know, again, we have some evidence that there's an issue with liquidity constraints. And if we have time in the end, I can talk about this evidence. It's up to you to judge exactly how much you're convinced by this. But we have quite a bit of evidence pointing for reasons why the cash transfers worked well. So the other interventions have not worked particularly well at all, and they haven't really had a lot of effect on the local Jordanians. So the interesting effects were in fact on Syrian refugees. So as I said, there are two main contributions. So the first one is going to be methodological, and the second one is going to be kind of like a labor and development contribution. And this methodological contribution is basically of coming up with an algorithm that is going to go beyond simply wanting to precisely estimate effects in experiments. And there's been other great work, including Max's wonderful work on this topic. You know, the thing I think to say at this point is that we are drawing on a very large literature on multi-arm bandit problems and adaptive randomization from the stats literature, which, you know, is, as you can see from the references here, is almost as kind of 100 years old. But I think one of the main contributions here is not just to come up with a new algorithm, but actually to implement it in the field, build the pipeline for implementing it in the field, and to evaluate whether it has worked or not. And, you know, as far as we know, this is the first time an adaptive targeted protocol has been used in a field experiment in a kind of development economic setting. So a lot of these algorithms are used to sell you ads on the internet, also to suggest you things when you want to, you know, turn on your favorite sort of streaming service, but not actually to help, you know, especially vulnerable populations do better. And the other side of this is that we think we're giving some of the first experimental evidence on labor market constraints faced by refugees in a developing country. So there's a lot of work in developed countries on refugees. There's, of course, a lot of work on labor market outcomes of vulnerable populations in developing countries, but actually getting hard experimental evidence on labor market outcomes of refugees in a developing country, we think we've sort of the first. But what's wonderful is that there's a big pipeline on the AEA registry of further experiments being conducted. And perhaps some of the people who are doing these experiments are even here, and they can maybe tell us about what they're doing and what they're up to, and that would be wonderful, wonderful to hear from them too. Okay, so good. And why don't I just tell you about the Tempered Thompson algorithm, unless anybody has any questions. All good? Okay.
So, Alexander, just a small clarification question. Yeah. So did you test also the different treatments in combination? For instance, information plus behavioral intervention, or no, it's only, okay, separately?
I'll be very precise about what exactly the treatments are. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, you're perfectly correct that they could have worked better in combination.
You might expect, yeah.
Yeah, you were only assigned one treatment here. Yeah. Although if you're interested in combinations of treatments, you might quite like to have a look at a paper that Max and I are working on called Adaptive Combinatorial Allocation, which kind of tries to get to some of these issues. It's on arXiv. It's not quite complete, but you might already be, if you find this interesting, you might already find that paper interesting. Okay, so let me quickly tell you about what our setting is. So we've got a cohort of refugees that are going to come in each one of these T periods, and we'll observe some covariates about them, you know, age, whether they've had past work experience, their gender, et cetera, et cetera. And we will put each one of the refugees in into a stratum, which we'll call X. So in practice, what we will have is going to be 16 different strata, which I'll tell you exactly what these are. But, you know, it's, you know, think of just kind of binary strata. Are you male or female? Do you have or not high school education, and so on? And then once you've been sort of allocated to a stratum, depending on your covariates, you will be assigned one of these D interventions. So to Timotei's question, there will just be 4 interventions, and you'll just be assigned one of them, not any combination. And what we will do is that we will observe an outcome for each individual who's been assigned an intervention after some Z periods. Now, Z is going to be much less than T. So T might be, you know, let's say if we do this weekly, it might be 52, it'll be a whole year, but we might observe an outcome after 6 weeks, for example. Okay, so we want to do 2 things. One is that we want to learn, so we want to precisely estimate the effect of the treatments in each stratum, right? That's just hopefully pretty familiar if you run RCTs. And the second thing we want to do is to maximize welfare. And again, very familiar if you just think about economic theory, we just want to maximize, optimize the outcomes of the participants. Now, these are observable outcomes. So we pick a metric, and in our case, this is going to be employment, formal employment after 6 weeks. Okay, and I think one of the things to kind of throw in already into the discussion in the last 15 minutes is, how does one select the right outcome for welfare maximization, especially when, of course, there's going to be potentially trade-offs between targeting short-term outcomes versus worrying about long-term welfare outcomes. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details of how to do this yet, but I think have this at the back of your mind that these choices need to be made, and this is the choice that we made: formal employment at 6 weeks. Okay. So how do we learn? How do we best learn? Well, okay, we have a great protocol. It's called random sampling. At each time period t, whatever stratum you're in, we're going to assign to you the treatment D with probability 1 over the number of treatments there are. So we're going to have 4 treatments. There's three interventions, 1 control. You get each treatment with probability 1/4. Okay, and we know that this randomization protocol is going to give us precise estimates of treatment effects in each stratum. It's great. We love it. It allows us to publish very important papers and win Nobel Prizes, and hopefully tell policymakers something about whether things actually work. And so why do we do this? Why do we have this crazy protocol in the first place? Well, it's because if we can precisely estimate the treatment effects, we can then go to the policymaker and say, look, these are the things that work and these are the things that don't work, and maybe you should go and act on this information and maybe implement these policies at a larger scale, right? That's why we do it. But it is certainly terrible for participant welfare, right? So it's very possible that very early on, you've figured out that a particular treatment is working really well, right? So, 10 weeks in, you're getting a very clear signal that a particular treatment is working really well for a particular stratum. And yet this protocol tells you for the rest of the experiment, keep assigning, the vast majority, really in our case, right, of the individuals to suboptimal treatments, even though these treatments are clearly not the best treatments for this particular cohort, right? So that's not great. Clearly, this is not going to be very good for participant welfare potentially, okay? So you might say, okay, well, then let's just have a complete different objective, which is welfare maximization. And so then we just set ourselves one goal, which is to maximize welfare of participants over time. Now, for that, all we need to do is to figure out what is the best intervention for each cohort. We don't actually care what is the effect of the second best treatment, of the third best treatment, and the fourth best treatment in and of themselves, right? Which is what we get from an RCT. But we just need to figure out what is the best intervention for each cohort. Now, of course, what might happen is very early on, you might be getting information that tells you that a particular treatment is really good. And so you might think, okay, well, maybe I should just assign this treatment to this cohort for the rest of the experiment. But of course, it's possible that this early information you've been getting is noisy. And so in fact, there is a better intervention that you've missed, right? Because of the kind of noise you got in the data. And so on the one hand, you want to give the best treatment to as many study participants as you can. On the other hand, you want to make sure that you do a bit of exploration and try out other treatments in case they actually work better, right? And so you want to make sure you don't miss it. And this is in fact it's what we call the exploitation trade-off. And typically it's kind of comes up in the context of what we call the multi-armed bandit problems. Okay, MAB, you might have seen that. So this trade-off about how much to explore and exploit here is actually to do well, right? So the exploitation is kind of supposed to have a good connotation. This trade-off analytically is really hard to pin down. So if you want to get an analytical solution, which is what a lot of economic theorists and statisticians have really liked to do, you're going to have to put some really strong assumptions on how the treatments affect people. And you can come up with beautiful closed form solutions, including this thing called the Gittins index. But this is not something that you might be happy with if you want a kind of a robust and useful tool to use in practice. So one of the things that, one of the ways of solving this problem reasonably well was a suggestion by a guy called Thompson in 1933, who said, look, you don't need to solve this problem optimally. Okay, don't try to solve it optimally. Use the following heuristic. Okay, and the heuristic works like this. So you start out with some prior that a particular treatment is the best treatment for a particular stratum. Then a bunch of information is going to come in that is going to allow you to update this probability that a particular treatment is the best treatment for a particular stratum later on. What you should do is to assign that treatment with that posterior probability to that stratum. Okay, so whatever you estimate to be the posterior probability, you should assign that treatment with that probability. Now, there's no reason for why that would be optimal. It's just kind of a reasonable thing to do. Why? Well, because what's happening is that later cohorts are clearly going to be assigned to treatments that are performing better. It's just you're doing this in this kind of perfectly linear way. As the probability, the posterior probability that the treatment is the best goes up, you kind of precisely increase the probability of assignment in tandem. Okay, and so this turned out to work remarkably well, and people had a lot of empirical evidence that this protocol was working exceptionally well in practice, and they couldn't quite figure out why until about 10 years ago, when they figured out that the regret, which is the difference in welfare from assigning the best possible treatment, which is the thing you're trying to find out, versus what you've actually assigned, converges to zero at the fastest possible rate. So in some sense, without getting too technical about this, the Thompson sampling is kind of as good of a solution as you can possibly hope for when it comes to welfare maximization. So that was kind of an amazing finding. There's been a lot of work especially among computer scientists and statisticians, exploring Thompson sampling because it has this amazing property. This very simple algorithm turns out to be, in a sense, optimal. But the problem that it has for us as development economists, I shouldn't count myself as a development economist, but the problem it has for development economists who are trying to publish papers in particular, or in fact for economists in general who are trying to learn things about the world, is that if you learn very quickly about what is the best treatment for a particular cohort, what the Thompson algorithm is going to tell you to do is to assign other treatments with an exceptionally low probability. If you're really certain that something is working really well, then why use anything else, right? And this might be a problem because what you will only find out about the best possible treatment, and you will not have any information about the effects of suboptimal treatments, which you might also want to learn something about, because maybe this future government will not be able to assign the best possible treatment. They might only be able to assign the second best possible treatment, right? And so you still want to have some of the things that we like, just sort of having the knowledge as economists about various treatment effects. The other issue that it does is actually it introduces a bias when it comes to doing inference. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but this exact approach is going to introduce its own issues, technical issues, which you would have to deal with separately. So what do? We do a very simple thing. In the spirit of doing heuristics, we say the following. Rather than using the ICT or the Thompson algorithm, use a convex combination of the two. So at each period, when you are coming to assign a treatment to an individual, with probability gamma, assign a treatment at random, as if you're in an RCT, and with probability 1 minus gamma, assign the treatment with probability dictated by the Thompson algorithm. That is the posterior probability that this treatment is optimal. Right? So if gamma is equal to 1, we recover standard RCT. If gamma is equal to 0, we recover the Thompson algorithm. And what we do is that we set our gamma equal to 0.2. Why is that? Is because we have 4 different treatments. And so we ensure that at least 5% of our population is going to be in each of the treatments. So we know, from the start, we know that we will have some data about the effects of all of the treatments, right? In the, in the eventuality that one of the treatments works particularly well. Okay.
Alexander, can I interrupt you with a question?
Sure.
Just curious, the Thompson algorithm, I mean, when you mean that in the sense of measuring the kind of the initial distribution of the treatment, I mean, does it matter how how sure we are that one is better than another? In the sense, clearly something is going to look better in the initial sample of the data, but, with a small sample, we might be getting, strong. I mean, that's clearly the reason. One of the reasons for your tempered approach, I guess, is that you might be getting. I mean, it might look like financial constraints matter a lot in the first 200 people you survey, and it turns out that's not the most effective policy.
Correct.
May I jump in on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
Sure. So what you're getting at is really like exactly the exploration trade-off, right? So what you have in mind is something like you see something performs best, and like the pure exploitation would be to go all in on that thing. That would be what's called the greedy algorithm, just use the one that performed best so far. And that's not a good idea exactly because you can get stuck on suboptimal things. But actually what Thompson already does is making this trade-off optimally in some sense, that the posterior uncertainty is reflected in the fact that the probabilities don't jump all the way to 1. But even though something performed well initially, because there's a prior that's regularizing everything, you're not going to go all the way in. And so kind of the theoretical results that Alex pointed to.
So the prior works to deal with the fact that you also have uncertainty around your estimates of how good an estimate is.
Exactly. That ensures that the probabilities don't jump all the way to 1 or 0 right away, right?
Okay. I'll have a slide on this.
It's a non-informative prior to start off with.
Correct. And so that's exactly what's going to happen. So we're I think in one slide, I will show you how this is set up very quickly. But since you ask, yes, we'll start with a reasonably non-informative prior. Yeah, and then exactly as Max said, to make sure that we don't immediately jump to conclusions that might be too early. Yeah. So that's our suggestion.
Sorry, Alex, may I jump in to ask a question? So you have this gamma that you put at 0.2. Is there any economic thinking on how to choose this gamma? Because I guess this is how much you value learning compared to how much you value welfare maximization. No, isn't that the trade-off between the two?
You're absolutely right. So you're absolutely right. So you can look at it in two ways, right? So one of them is a kind of practical consideration, right? So one of them is exactly the trade-off that you've identified, right? That's precisely, if you like, our objectives as researchers towards the welfare of the participants. The other one was, honestly, the way we came up with it, and I hope Max agrees with roughly how this went. We asked our development economics colleagues, what is a reasonable amount of people we would want to have in kind of the lower bound on the number of people we would want to have in each of the treatments. And they said it'd be nice to have 5% and at least in each one. And so we came up with 0.2. That's exactly what you get if you have 4 treatments, right? So you're absolutely right. Of course, what gamma is actually capturing is something much deeper. And so it actually reveals something about our preferences as researchers about how we treat the welfare of the participants. And maybe you think this is appalling and it should, of course, be at 0. And, that would be fair, right? So this is where I'm going with this, there's good reasons for why it should be 0. But I think it's reasonable for it not to be 0, especially for the reasons I discussed, which is that actually you want to learn about suboptimal treatments in many practical contexts.
But maybe also a partial answer to that. So in the paper, we characterize how estimator precision depends on the gamma and how participant welfare depends on the gamma.
Next slide.
Sorry, I shut up.
Yeah, perfect segue. So this is actually exactly what Max is getting to. And actually, all the properties of the algorithm are going to depend on gamma. So in particular, we have a theorem, which I'm not going to show you the formal statement of, but what Thompson's really doing is that it's maximizing the welfare of participants subject to the constraint that the previous question was really asking about, that every treatment is assigned at least gamma over number of treatments. And actually what it allows us to do is to trade off these two objectives. So on the one hand, as gamma goes up, regret is going to go up. You're moving away from the Thompson algorithm. On the other hand, the asymptotic variance is going to decrease because you're moving closer towards an RCT. And so you get this exact trade-off. And so gamma allows you to nicely capture the trade-off between these two objectives. And this is formal and hopefully allows you to make decisions that are, well-informed. And in particular, what you get is consistent, asymptotically unbiased and normally distributed estimators of the treatment effects. You can do standard Bayesian inference, and you can also perform randomization inference. And a lot of this really, this pipe work and this kind of beauty of this is due to Max. So he, I think, gets, massive amounts of credits for setting this up. And again, I don't want to maybe spend too long on this because I do want to tell you about the results. But the way that we set up our targeting is using a hierarchical Bayesian model. And exactly as one of the questions alluded to, we start out with a reasonably sort of diffuse, uninformative prior, and we update from there. Okay, so I'm not going to kind of cover this too much. We might come back to this briefly in the discussion if you want. Okay, so let me just quickly tell you about the context. You all know about this because you're all migration scholars, so you know about the Syrian refugee crisis, and there are a lot of Syrian refugees in Jordan at the moment, almost 700,000. You can see this line that more or less stabilized very quickly. Now, we're not thinking about refugee camps in this context. These are refugees that live mainly in urban areas, but the poverty rates among them are very high. So 90% of them live below the poverty line. And what happened is maybe some of you are familiar with, is this idea of the Jordan Compact, whereby the EU has said that they're going to give firms relief on import duties to the EU if they hire a lot of Syrian in Jordan. And so we were hoping that in that context, which is very unusual for a refugee setting, right? In many contexts you might study, refugees are barred from working completely in the hosting country. Here, not only are they sort of encouraged to work in principle, in theory at least, but in fact the government and the international community is going far and beyond this and offering, tax breaks to firms that hire the refugees. Now, of course, it still makes it difficult on the ground to hire refugees, and there's still paperwork, bottlenecks, and all of that. But we thought this might be a very mild context as a refugee labor market, and so some of the active labor market policies that worked elsewhere might have worked here. Okay, so quickly about the interventions. As I said, one of the interventions is cash. It's just an unconditional cash transfer. Loads of evidence that this stuff has worked to activate sort of job search and so on. And this was an unconditional cash transfer of about $100. Now, this allows them, so having surveyed and looked at the expenditure on job search, this would allow the average job seeker to double their search expenditure for about 9 weeks, which seems quite reasonable as an amount. The second intervention is the information intervention, and here what we do is we provide, the enumerators provide a lot of information about how to do the job search and application process and what to expect from a job. And again, previous evidence has shown that this stuff can be very effective. And this is done with flyers and short videos. And flyers look a bit like this, as you can see in Arabic, obviously. And then finally, the last one is behavioral support. And this is coming from on the back of a big literature on self-control problems and intention behavior gaps. Again, there's a lot of evidence that this stuff works in other contexts. And what this was is basically a job search planning session where we helped participants design a job search calendar, similar to some of what other people have done, and then send them SMS reminders for their job search goals. Interestingly, the qualitative sort of evidence, this kind of from the interviews that came in, the way that the refugees responded to this is by saying this was a nice intervention because it looked like the enumerators sort of cared about the refugees beyond the interview. So there seemed to be this, it kind of had an interesting effect, which I guess wasn't immediately obvious, is that somehow this kind of intervention felt like it made refugees feel really good that, the enumerators are still there with them, looking out and hoping that they will do well going forward. So anyway, and Max did some of these interviews and he can tell you about them as well. So this is on the calendar end.
Sorry, Alex, one question. To what extent, can you tell us a little bit about potential spillovers to the control group, particularly of the information intervention? Did the flyers circulate?
I don't know. I doubt it. I mean, in part, it seems like the refugees, right? So because there's not a camp setting, because we're sort of thinking about a setting that is urban, I'm sort of not sure that you need to worry about spillovers quite so much. So yeah, I mean, these didn't look like flyers that were that worth, they didn't go on the black market, you know what I mean, and kind of be directed. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah, it didn't seem like it was a big deal.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so this was all happening in 2019, thank God, and just finished in time for COVID to be discovered in China, amazingly enough. So you had to be obviously eligible to work and be interested in taking up a job. And what we measure is wage employment by phone at 6 weeks. And all three parts of this is actually important. Okay, so this is what our implementation partner wanted to measure, and this was our outcome. So when we're talking about welfare maximization, what we're actually wanting to maximize is wage employment done by phone after 6 weeks. Okay, and then we've got follow-up.
Should emphasize.
Sorry?
Formal employment.
Formal, yes. I mean, sort of formal wage employment after 6 weeks with a by phone. Okay, and there are also follow-up surveys that are done in person after 2 and 4 months after intake, and the attrition was pleasingly low. So as I said, there are 16 strata that all the refugees fall into. One of them, and they're all binary. There's 4 binary covariates. That's where you get the 16. There's whether you're Syrian or Jordanian, you're male or female, whether or not you have high school education, and whether or not you've had work experience. So everyone falls into one of these bins, and all the registration is here. And as you can see, Max is the host of the algorithm. So you can see who did the lion's share of the hard work on the coding. Okay, results. Impacts on 6 week, and as Max said, formal, this part is very crucial, formal wage employment conducted over the phone. Essentially, there hasn't really been much effect, sadly enough. So as you can see, there's not been much of an effect on the Syrians, or for that matter, on the Jordanians beyond the control group. So the interventions effectively have not worked particularly well. So this is the credible sets for average potential outcomes. And on the right, we have the interventions relative to the control group. So you can see that they all overlap with the 0. So that might have been a little bit discouraging, but what might be useful, I think, to see is actually how the Tempered Thompson algorithm performed. And so what you see here is a graph of the probabilities of assignment of each treatment to participants. So we start the experiment, and this is, the yellow line to the very, very left. And then 6 weeks later, as I said, we're going to get our first data. So we start out with our prior, 6 weeks later, we're going to get our initial data, because this will be the outcomes of the refugees who were assigned treatments in the first week. And so at that point, we're able to update our priors and get our posteriors, and the Tempered Thompson algorithm will tell us about how we should change the probabilities of assignment at that point. And as you can see, very early on, we got very excited. I still remember this. It was a lot of excitement about the nudge treatment working unbelievably well, and its probability of assignment jumped all the way to 0.4. And we thought, hooray, Dick Taylor is a genius. How is this working so well? We were very pleased. But that only lasted for a couple of weeks, and that's kind of exactly what we talked about originally, is that some of the initial data might just be noisy, and that's why the Thompson algorithm is trying to capture this and ensure that other treatments are still being assigned to the refugees. And as you can see, the probabilities fluctuated, but essentially they fluctuated more or less around 0.25. And the reason why this happened is because none of the treatments was particularly powerful, right? So if there's one treatment that really stood out, eventually you would hope that after 40 weeks of the experiment, we would have been able to find it. But because there hasn't been a treatment that's been particularly good or better than all the other treatments, the assignment, it looks reasonably close to what you would get if you just did a randomized control trial. Okay, so this, you might say this is just because we're a bit unlucky, and it's very hard to get refugees jobs, and it's very hard to come up with a treatment that would help refugees get jobs. So that's not really the fault of the algorithm. As we said, we know that this algorithm is supposed to perform very well if there is something to find, but maybe there was nothing to find in this particular case. So I'll qualify that a little bit. And in particular, you can also, if you look across the different strata, you find a bit of heterogeneity and some hopeful differences. So in particular, if you look at the very bottom, you might see that the nudge treatment seems to have worked a bit better than the control treatment. But I wouldn't put too much weight on this because there are a lot of strata, and so you would expect to find some differences somewhere. Okay, so one of the things that we did do that is probably worth talking about at the very end in my last few minutes is actually trying to evaluate to what extent our algorithm has done better compared to just doing a random assignment. So this table is worth looking at probably from the bottom. So the first thing you might think about is to say, okay, well, how much better in terms of welfare did the Tempered Thompson algorithm you've implemented do compared to simply running a randomized control trial? Okay, and that's the bit that's called reduction in regret. That's the third line over here, and you can see not by much, but in particular, unfortunately, the credible set overlaps with 0. So we can't really reject the fact that we've had no effect on welfare with our algorithm, which is a little bit unfortunate. The other thing you might look at is to say, okay, well, how good is the best targeted intervention compared to no intervention? That's the first line. And how good is the best non-targeted intervention compared to the no intervention scenario? And that's the two numbers in the first and the second line. Now, if you take the difference between these two, this tells you the benefit of targeting. And this turns out to be on the order of about 1%, which is reasonably substantial, given that we're looking at employment rates on the order of sort of 5% or so. So this is quite big, actually. So there's been some modest gains from doing targeting, but not a lot of gains from doing adaptivity, or if you like, the whole package of adaptivity and targeting. Okay, so that's probably where I should stop for now. We've got more. This might look a bit discouraging, but actually what's been very interesting is that because we had follow-up surveys at 2 months and at 4 months, and these were conducted in person, what we found, and I'm going to just blast some tables at you, but people who do empirical work have a knack for like reading these tables really quickly, which I don't. But if you look at the cache column, you sort of see, if you look at the top row, especially the first two numbers at the top row, you will see some good and significant effects, right? There's some like encouraging numbers, and the numbers in the brackets look sufficiently small to get some of you, I think, reasonably excited. And so after 2 months, we started seeing these effects, and these effects seem to have persisted for 4 months. And this has been consistent for a lot of measures like employment and earnings. Again, if you look at the top line, you will see that there's been an effect of cash on employment and on earnings. And this has actually stayed on after 4 months as well. So even though the effects of the other treatments, which also look like they might work, disappear, the effects of cash on employment and on earnings was significant even after 4 months. So I think what we're learning here, and this is one of the things that you can kind of interpret these findings with, perhaps with a little pinch of salt, but I think we're getting some evidence here that cash does have an effect on employment and on earnings and on other kind of activation of job search and so on. And we've got some evidence in the paper to suggest that it looks like the reason for this is to do with liquidity constraints. And I've got a few slides on this that I'm not going to bore you with at the moment, but we can maybe discuss if any of you would like to. So, of course, this is a little bit unfortunate in a way, right? Because when we set up our Tempered Thompson algorithm, it was not using the 2 and 4 month data. It was using the 6-week data. And so, perhaps had we used one of the later surveys and used as our outcome maybe the 2 of the 4 months outcomes, we would have been able to, the Tempered Thompson algorithm could have performed as it should and sort of show that the cash treatment is the best one, and we could have actually improved the welfare of the refugees a little bit more. So this does raise a lot of interesting questions about exactly how to pick the right outcome and how to do that. And I think Max and I would be very glad to discuss this as we're working on these questions at the moment. So anyway, just to conclude, I realize I'm a little bit over time, Jesus, apologies, but I am literally on the last slide. So what are the big takeaways, I think? Well, as I said, there were two. One of them is this very neat, we think, little assignment protocol, which I think we are, what we've really done here is not just to develop the theory for it, but really implement it, build this great pipework for it, and really raise a lot of methodological issues around how to do this in general, right? And I think you should take that as one of our contributions, is we really think this was, not trivial to do. And so we would really love for more people to run adaptive field experiments in the future. And so this is kind of a first step towards it. But what's nice, our protocol is also kind of nice, because as I said, we have one parameter that allows us to balance welfare and treatment effect estimation. And that's quite nice. And it's easy now for you to deploy it in the field, because, Max has done most of the work actually setting it up. And we've done some work to make sure that the standard econometrics actually carry over. And so there's loads of interesting design challenges. Happy to discuss them now. If you're interested in the impact on the job search, we can also discuss these, because again, we think it's completely new experimental evidence on the effect on refugee labor market outcomes in a developing country. And indeed, it seems like the liquidity constraints might be one of the key barriers to their labor market participation. Thank you so much. And I guess I'm happy to have to discuss things with you.
Okay, so let's move directly to the discussion section. So we have questions from the floor, actually, from David Bernard. So David, do you want to ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for that presentation. It's really interesting. I guess one of the conclusions seems to be then that 6 weeks is too short to observe outcomes that are relevant for welfare. So then I was wondering if you had thought much about how to deal with this trade-off, where if you want to take these sort of longer term outcomes, it's going to take you longer to learn. You have to wait sort of 2 or 4 months before you update your prior.
So I guess, I was really trying to stress that there were 3 things about our outcome which might have been a problem. So one of them was focusing specifically on formal employment. That might have just been not exactly the right measure, but that's the one that our implementation partner wanted to focus on. I think it's perfectly reasonable. And also this was done over the phone, and we sort of got, I think we had some evidence that actually people were a bit more concerned reporting things over the phone. So it's perfectly possible if we'd looked at informal employment and we did it in person after 6 weeks, even we would have got some effects even at 6 weeks. Right? So I guess that's one part of the question. I mean, you're totally right. It could have just been a short-term thing, right? But it might not have been just a short-term thing. I guess the second part that you said is what is the correct timeline? And here I think, I think Max should really jump in. I guess the kind of short answer for this might be, what matters is, what is your measure of welfare? I think one should start with the question is, what is an appropriate measure of welfare, or what is an appropriate indicator of longer term welfare, right? But regardless of what timeline you pick, for the welfare of study participants, it will still be better to use an adaptive design than it would be to use an RCT. So
maybe just to jump in quickly on that too. So this is actually a fairly large debate in various fields, including in biostatistics for clinical trials and in AI for the design of autonomous agents. Where in biostatistics, it's discussed under the header of surrogate outcomes, which is kind of often the question in clinical trials. You care about things like long-run mortality, but you don't want to wait until mortality is realized for everyone. And so clinical trials tend to take intermediate outcomes. So I know, for instance, you care about heart attacks, and then you take blood pressure as the intermediate outcome or something like that. And there's discussions under what conditions that is a legitimate approach or not. So I would like to point to that. And then I guess in AI, there's this big debate about the alignment problem, which is essentially what happens if you specify an objective that is maybe close to what you want to maximize, but not quite the right thing. And under some conditions, things can go pretty poorly if you're maximizing the wrong thing too well. But there's kind of a lot of ongoing research, I guess, in this domain.
And the paper by Athey on this slide is the one. I mean, Athey et al. 2019 probably doesn't actually tell you which paper it is, but it's the paper on surrogate outcomes that Max have just mentioned. So there is a good literature on that.
Okay,
I see
thanks.
Max has been very busy answering a lot of questions. Max, thank you so much.
We have lots of questions and lots of people who want to ask right now. So we have at least 3 more people online. So let me go to Julie Bousquet.
Hi, I have a very quick question. Would you say that this intervention will be more costly than a standard RCT approach? Because it seems to me that you may have a larger sample. And so yeah, would you be able to compare and say that it's more or less expensive than the RCT?
So it depends what you want to cost, right? So, if you want to have, if all you care about is the cost of getting precision of your treatment effects, it will have to be more expensive because it's going to be less precise, right, than doing an RCT. But of course, that's not what, I guess part of what we're suggesting is that you should not be just focusing on that in your cost, right? So in particular, if you care about the welfare of the participants and you balance the benefits to them against the cost, then in fact, something that looks like the Thompson algorithm is essentially the optimal thing to do, right? Because you're maximizing, you'll in fact be maximizing welfare, and you can take the cost into account. So yeah, I hope that part is clear, right? So it depends what you want to be paying for, and we are suggesting that you should not just be paying for having very precise treatment effects.
So maybe also on that. So there are different components of the cost you might care about, right? One is the number of participants, and for that, exactly as Alex said, you maximize the thing you want to maximize, and that's it. Of course, there's also the cost of implementation, which doing this the first time, this did involve a bit more work than doing a standard RCT. That being said, so I put a bunch of code online, and with Anja Sautman, my co-author for a related project, we're kind of working on making this easily accessible. So I think that, I don't know, this should turn fairly soon into something that you can take pretty much off the shelf, and then as long as your enumerators have maybe some tablets or phones that can just display them, like which treatment they should assign to particular participants, then the implementation cost is the same once the researcher side is taken care of.
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying that you don't incur any extra costs during the survey, right? Because you still need to survey the same people, and all that happens is that a different number appears on the laptop of the enumerator, and as Max said, that number is calculated hopefully using the pipeline that we're sort of providing. And there might be a lot of variations on this pipeline, but at least a lot of the initial work has already been done. So hopefully it will not take you as long as it took us. I mean, I guess there is one small thing maybe to point out for the sake of being incredibly honest. The pipeline needs to run. You need to be a little bit more, I think, careful with how your server is running, because you need to calculate. You need to make sure your data is there to be able to calculate your posteriors. And so, if your server actually goes down and you've lost access to the data, you can't do what you were doing in RCT and just randomize within that particular period, right? So you need to be a little bit more careful with that. You can imagine I'm saying this because this is the kind of thing that we faced very briefly, but it was actually a very good lesson that you need to back up and make sure these things kind of happen. But I think apart from that, there shouldn't really be any extra costs from doing this, right?
Okay, so let me go back to Jeremy, to whom we had unmuted for no reason. So sorry, Jeremy, please go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. So we've touched on this a bit, but my question is, about when does it make sense to add additional components into the welfare beyond just the study outcomes? So in the case of cash, even if it's not increasing employment, it clearly benefits participants. So, and if there were a situation where all of the participants were equally bad at increasing employment, then ideally you would just shift to cash if you had to give one treatment. So, how do you incorporate these things into the welfare analysis?
So, okay, so I guess we tried to be quite precise about what we define by welfare, right? So we said that our welfare is the number of people that is going to get employment after 6 weeks, right? And everything else that we're using is an instrument toward achieving that welfare maximization goal, right? So you're right that cash in and of itself has an effect on welfare, and you might think, okay, well, maybe I should net that out because it's kind of the cost of the experiment, right? So I think, start with what the welfare is, and this goes back to the first question. Start with what you think the welfare is and what is achievable and measurable within the timescale of the experiment and what you can measure with the survey tools that you have, and then work back from there. So maybe formal wage employment is not the right thing to measure, right? At all. Maybe that's actually not a very good proxy for welfare. Who knows, right? It might be something that's completely different. Or maybe you're not actually interested in welfare at all. You just care about some other outcome, and then you want to, focus on that particular outcome. So I hope I've answered your question. Maybe I sort of missed a deeper point you were making.
But also nothing prohibits you using composite indices as your outcome, right?
Absolutely.
So if you have a more complicated notion of welfare that you can operationalize,
absolutely,
that might involve your income, might involve your employment, might involve your health, whatever it is, and you have a sense how to trade these off, then you can put them in one index that you're maximizing. And
yeah, if that's what you're getting at, absolutely. So you can really pick whatever you want, you can measure and calculate, and just go ahead and do it, right? There's no reason why it could be something completely different, right? Welfare is just, as economists, I think when we think about maximizing something for somebody else, we typically think about maximizing their utility, right? And we can't observe their utility, but we hopefully have some proxies for what we think their utility is, and we want to get as close to that as we possibly can.
Yeah, thanks. That answers my question. I was just thinking about how that's, it's one of the difficult decisions a researcher would have to make when using this approach.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, look, we're not, this approach does not solve the biggest problems in doing all experimental work and doing work in public economics in general, right? So all the previous problems you will have with not being able to observe utility are going to remain here for sure.
Okay, so we are going a little bit over time, but let me give the floor to Delia, who raised her virtual hand a while ago. So please, Delia, ask your question, and we finish with that.
Sounds good. My question is actually very similar to the one before. Hi, Alex.
Hey, nice to see you. Sorry.
Excellent to see you. Let me ask my question. So the entire time you were talking, I was thinking about vaccines and how if I was in the trial, I would absolutely want a Pfizer or Moderna, but as a human being, I want them to continue to be checking AstraZeneca just because it's so much cheaper to make those vaccines. And it's similar to your context where the cash may be the most effective, but it's also the most expensive, not only in the experiment that we've already talked about, but if we wanted to implement it, it would be a lot more expensive. And my question was, could you incorporate that into your analysis, or have you thought about doing that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Max said about the index, right? I mean, in principle, you can start out and just say, okay, we're going to, do things in per dollar terms. I guess you sort of know this from the start that some things are going to be more expensive than others, sort of ex post, you evaluate them, but there's no reason for why you can't do this in the first place, right? So you would, what it would mean is that you would demand much stronger effects. And so as you saw, even with this $100 intervention, the effects were very small. Now, I'm sure you're totally right in other contexts. And in fact, Max and I have a little paper about targeted infectious disease testing, not quite vaccination. But indeed, if something is much cheaper, but only slightly less effective, you might want to incorporate that into your proxy for welfare, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Alex, Max, for a wonderful job, and thank you all participants and panelists, and I hope to see you back here next week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you for great sharing. Thanks.